Well, welcome everybody to Kinship Cafe. I'm your host, Jim Jones. So glad you could join us today. And we are continuing through the Daodejing. And today we are in chapter 21. Go ahead and share my screen. All right. So let's go ahead and get started here. Maybe. There we go. Okay. So I'm just putting in square brackets here the more modern way of spelling these words so it's easier to kind of see it, because I know that there's because of the history of the translation with a T, these words sometimes get confused. Are we talking about two different things? Well, they're the same thing. It's just we've evolved the way that we transliterate the Chinese characters into English. So the first line of chapter 1 reads, "The great Da," and it looks like D, but it's pronounced Da. "The great Da appears flowing from Tao." So we'll just kind of pause here for a minute, because this is a key term. If we think about the Daodejing, the Da here is that middle word, and it's going to be quite significant for how we think about what this chapter is about. In particular, because it's one, calling it great, but also that it flows directly from Tao. So we need to have some kind of sense of what's going on with this concept of Da. So I'm going to look at a couple of pieces in that regard. So the first part, we're going to look at the character that makes it up, because I think it helps to kind of break down a bit of what they're trying to get at there. And this is kind of a combination of several different characters into a single character that kind of build upon each other to come up with a particular meaning. So sometimes with the Chinese characters, they'll include other Chinese characters in order to give you a sense of how to pronounce it, and other times because it's doing kind of a compound meaning. So in this case, from what I understand, and again, I'm not a Chinese scholar, but in my research on this, this is more of a kind of a compound meaning that's coming together. So if we look at the different elements, we can start to look at what this kind of breaks down. So if we think about this as kind of like two halves, it's not exactly in half, but on the far left side of this, it looks like you've got kind of two downward strokes and then a vertical stroke. That's actually a single character. Keep that off to the side for the minute. And on the right-hand side, we're going to go from kind of the top to bottom. So on the top of that, it looks like there's kind of a cross or a plus sign. That's actually the Chinese character for 10. The character immediately below that is the character for I, or eyes. And then you have that straight line across, which is the character for 1. So the first part of what you have here is this idea that 10 sets of eyes are all perceiving this one thing. So there's like this idea of accurate perception, or that they're seeing clearly, or that there's something that's just kind of helping us understand specifically that there's agreement in what they're understanding and perceiving. I almost kind of think about like in scientific terms, where there's this desire to have consensus, that it can be verified from other people, that if you run through the same experiment, you see things the same way. And I think that's what this first part is getting at. And then the part underneath that kind of looks like the 3 raindrops with a little swoop there, this is actually a little bit of a scrunched version of the character for heart and or mind. And I say and or mind because in different cultures, heart and mind are kind of used in different ways, where the heart can also be the locus of thought, whereas for us, it tends to be the locus of meaning, but not meaning, but emotion. For a lot of other cultures, a lot of times that meaning part comes from, or that emotion part comes from the guts or the kidneys, but they think with the heart. So it's kind of a combination maybe of emotion fused thought. Not sure exactly where they would have been with that, but it's frequently translated either as heart or as mind. And then, so we've got like this idea then of this 10 eyes seeing the one thing clearly, bringing in the idea of heart or mind, which I think is going to get into. So we've got this perception, and then we've got this either meaning or this emotion. And then the character that was off to the left that we kind of set aside for a minute has to do with taking a step. So if we bring it all together, you have something along the lines of like perfect hearted action, seeing clearly with the heart or the mind, and then this idea of movement or action. So this then is going to come about in a couple of different ways in terms of how Taoism is working with this concept of Da. Sometimes it's being translated or thought about in terms of character. So this would be a person who's demonstrating perfect-hearted action, or it can be things and that are existing in some kind of perfect-hearted way. But if we think back to what our text was saying, that the Da flows from Tao, that there is this perfect-hearted part of it has to do with this relationship with Tao. So in that sense, we kind of start to see this pattern where Tao is this idea of, it kind of ties in with the idea of Wu, which is this idea of absence. It's this idea of no thingness, but yet it's kind of there's something to it. It's just not manifest into something. And there's this movement to you or presence, manifestation, form with form. And of course, this goes back and forth. Things come into existence, we could say. It's a difficult term to use because it's not like it didn't exist prior, it just didn't exist in the same way, right? So it's this coming into form and out of form that goes back and forth that creates this pattern that's being demonstrated. And so Da can be seen as what this patterns of Tao manifests like. It becomes like this manifestation of Tao, and therefore it can then be used as a way to talk about things like the 10,000 things, or about character and other ways that we might talk about people. So again, the Wu side of things, the absence, it can also be tied in with what's frequently used in terms of Chinese thought as qi. So qi is kind of like this underlying substance, so to speak, as well. And so then as it moves into presence, as it moves into you, it can be talked about either in terms of like the 10,000 things, or as Da, which would be in reference to things that are manifest according to that pattern. And then that also then gives us a way of thinking about this idea of character for individuals. But the first part of it here, for the line that we're looking at, it's more this idea that there is a way that things unfold because of these patterns that give rise to the 10,000 things that are representative of what those patterns, how they come into being, how they manifest as a result of those patterns of Tao. Maybe before I go to the next screen, I'll just pause there for a second. Oops, too far. So any thoughts about this before I go forward? Is it making sense, or did this sound kind of crazy?
A little overwhelming.
So the basic thing we could think of is that there's, if we bring it like into kind of modern day language, we've got all these different kinds of things out there that we don't necessarily perceive directly in terms of like particles and atoms that can come together in different ways to form molecules and on up into larger things that we can actually observe and and see and interact with. Those would be like the manifestations of these still there particles that we don't actually get to see, but how they come together is through patterns that are, regular in terms of things like the laws of physics, the basic fundamental forces that we have, and how they interact with each other combine to make these ever larger things that ultimately come into our awareness. So there's a pattern that brings things into existence, we might say, that are representatives of those patterns. So if we look at anything that we see, it's an example of those patterns being manifest, right? If I'm looking at my computer, in a certain sense, it's made up of all the different kinds of elements that represent what these patterns in nature are in terms of how it ultimately gets manifest. And the same thing is true for me and you and everything that we come in contact with. So that's kind of the core idea, is that everything is, in a sense, kind of a perfect example of those patterns and the fact that it comes into existence. Does that make a little more sense?
I'm with you.
Okay.
Yep.
So then we get to that kind of question, like, how do we talk about the fact that something seems like it's coming out of nothing? We're saying that nothing isn't nothing in the sense of no thing. It's just that it is like without form. It's still pregnant with this idea of possibility, but it's not manifest in some way. And that's kind of where the poem goes from here. It starts to look at this and wrestle with those ideas. So Tao in action says it's only vague and intangible. And as it is essentially vague and intangible, it says, but within it are images. Vague and intangible within are entities. So it's like this thing that we can't quite get our hands around. We can't quite see it. We can't quite interact with it. But yet somehow these images and these entities exist within it. It says shadowy, obscure. Within it, there is life. Life so real that within it there is trust. Now, this is kind of a little bit of an interesting word here, like trust. What does that mean? How does that come into play? So I want to talk about that for a bit, but this idea that it's difficult to kind of wrestle with what seems like something coming out of nothing. But again, nothing is still something. It's just something that we're not actually able to observe and interact with directly. It still is that source from where all these things are able to come together and ultimately manifest. And part of that is also this idea of life. So here we want to look at, what do they mean by trust? So this is coming from this word, I believe it's pronounced Zhen. And it does mean trust, but it's used in different ways and in different contexts. And so we have to kind of think about, what do they mean by trust and how is that playing out in this particular context? So one of the ways that they suggest that this should actually be translated is that it's more along the lines of trust in the regularity of the pattern. And in this case, that life grows, that life expands. And so it's part of that pattern of that regularity where that trust comes into play, that maybe should actually be translated or thought of more in terms of the growth aspect or the expansive aspect, rather than the trust aspect in terms of how it's translated. So just to kind of review that, here they're saying that within it is life, the elements that are needed for life. real life, like it's actual life, something that has real potentiality, and that it can be trusted, or in the sense that it has the potential for growth. And I'll just bring in a separate translation here that brings out more of those ideas. So that same passage would read, dark and dim, in it there is life seed. Its life seed being very genuine. In it there is growth power. So it's this idea of, the generative nature of life that is almost like magical in the sense of how that works, that there's this amazing ability for it to grow and transform and adapt, and its resiliency. But of course it ultimately goes through these cycles and it returns back to, the absence. But there's definitely this power of with life that's very different from things that are not living. Then it concludes, and I'm going to switch to a little bit of a different translation here. It's the other primary one that we use, the Feng in English, because I think this one brings out the ending part a little bit more clearly. It says, from the very beginning until now, its name has never been forgotten. So remember, we're talking about this process of day or da emerging from Tao, and that this whole thing, we could even say, even like its reputation when it's using name, because it might not be that everybody had the same name, but the reputation of it has never been forgotten. And this is where I think we're getting hints again that Taoism is really a preserving of more of a Paleolithic perspective on life that's being held on to, that's preserved through this tradition, more kind of an indigenous way of looking at how things are related to each other and how we connect with them. So it's never been forgotten. Maybe some people have forgotten about it, but overall it continues to exist. And he continues to say, thus I perceive creation. And you think, well, what does that mean? How do I know the ways of creation? And then it ends with this very enigmatic line. He says, because of this. And there's lots of ways we could try and ask the question, well, what does he mean because of this? But most of the commentators that I see think that he's referring to the thing that he just said. There's kind of multiple ways that they refer to it. Some think that this was like if he was speaking of this verbally, that as he said, because of this, he might have been pointing to himself, like that there was some type of inward reflection or intuition that he had. But others would suggest that it is actually referring back to what this whole chapter is about. So that opening line would have been the the da flows from Tao. Because of this, I can see the manifestations of it. It gives evidence to the patterns. We might not be able to see the patterns in action. We can't see something like gravity, but we see the effects of it. We see the outcome of it. So the perfect-hearted action of creation is a demonstration of the reality of Tao, of those patterns, and that would be what the because of this is. Does that make sense? Kind of.
I think I'm following.
Yeah. So pretty much there's just like this core concept at the beginning, that there's this manifestation of the 10,000 things from Tao, and that the reason it's referred to as Da is because it is demonstrating the reality of Tao in its existence, that it's a product of these unfolding patterns, and therefore it's a perfect example of those patterns in terms of the idea of perfect heartedness, but it is also evidence of how this process works. So even though Tao or Qi or absence are all these kind of elusive things that seem vague and intangible and you can't get your hands on it, still within that is the possibilities of everything that emerges, including life, which has this amazing power to grow. And again, the question is, how do you know all of this? And he says, basically, look around. All these things that we see, we can see these patterns being enacted. Even if we can't see the patterns themselves, we see the result. So this brings up a very interesting part of, so again, we're back to this opening kind of line as far as how, because of this is kind of referring to this. But the other piece that this brings up then is a very interesting aspect about Taoism. And one of the reasons why I find it so intriguing personally, coming from a naturalist perspective, is the necessity of regular patterns. And if we think about how everything functions, there's a couple places where we can see this coming into play. One, it makes life possible. If there wasn't these regular patterns, if there wasn't things that we could discern in terms of our environment that happen as a result of certain things and how they unfold, we wouldn't be able to understand how to do anything. I've used a couple of examples, like if one day I jump up and I come back down, but the next day I jump up and I fly off to the moon, that's not real helpful in terms of things being able to exist. It's like there has to be some kind of way that things are regularly happening, because if everything was random all the time and there was no consistency, nothing would really exist. Atoms wouldn't stick together, right? I mean, even atoms themselves everything would just be chaos. There would be nothing. The patterns are necessary for even the very possibility of life. So this is a key thing that we have to recognize, is that these patterns aren't just a nice to have, they're essential. They're necessary for everything that we experience. It also is what makes learning possible. So because there are regular ways in which things happen, we can notice those and start to get an understanding of how things happen and how they work. So we start to figure out, oh, this is okay to eat. This isn't okay to eat. Oh, this kind of animal is dangerous because I saw what it did to my friend. There's just all different kinds of things that we learn from all these things, because these patterns are repeatable. It's learnable. If it wasn't repeatable, if it was always random, there is no learning. There is no ability to grow in any kind of understanding of our environment. So at a kind of fundamental level for naturalism, or even science more generally, there's this basic position that states that the universe is, at least in theory, knowable. Not necessarily that we can know everything about it, or we even have the mental capacity to understand everything about it. But in principle, it's knowable because everything is operating according to these patterns that can be used to understand stuff, right? So learning itself requires that there's some kind of regular pattern. But what's really interesting about this then is it's also what makes change possible. So if we understand that A leads to B and that gives us C, then when we see A, if we've been paying attention to the pattern, we could potentially intervene and tweak B or make it go to E, and then we're going to get a different result. And we can start to understand those patterns, and it gives us the ability then to interact with our environment in different ways in order to move towards different types of goals or things that we're trying to achieve. Again, this is only possible because of these regular patterns that make up how everything works. Now, the weird part about this then is it gets into this problem of, if everything is causally chained together, then the idea of free will as it's popularly thought about doesn't make any kind of sense. It ends up being kind of more of an illusion. because free will in this sense would say that we had the ability to do something different, that it wasn't fully caused by everything that came before. So this is one of those things where we get into this strange loop that we kind of have a lot of pushback or resistance about the idea that that we don't have free will, because we want to think that we have that option available to us. But at the same time, what free will would actually require is not really what we're after, because it would mean things aren't based on what happened before. It's not based, our actions aren't based off of what we've learned or what we've developed or the skills we've connected. It is something that could be potentially random, and random isn't part of how everything functions. If things were actually random, all the rest of life actually kind of falls apart. So it's interesting in that the thing that seems the most scary to us, this idea that everything would be determined by these patterns, these laws, is actually the same thing that gives us what we actually are after, which is the ability to actually interact with and engage with our environment. Because of those patterns that make it so that we don't actually have free will, it does give us the possibility of being able to learn, and it does give us the possibility for being able to make change that wouldn't be possible without those patterns. So the other piece we probably need to throw in here is this idea of making choices, because I think a lot of times that's where we get that sense of free will is, didn't I have the choice to choose between A and B? And didn't I choose the thing I wanted? And the answer is yes. You just didn't get to choose what you wanted. Which sounds like a paradox, but it's like, if I have a choice between pizza and a hamburger, and I want to have pizza because I like pizza better, you can choose pizza, but you didn't get to choose that you like pizza. Does that make sense? You following that?
Yeah. Yep.
So I have thoughts here,
Yeah.
especially after following the Deaths series. I've been on board with this predeterministic view and the lack of free will per se, up until the point when they were on that damn bridge, whatever they were, towards the end of the season. And I'm thinking with the patterns, I think it's about the patterns themselves. If the patterns are real patterns in terms of they are repeating, they are following the same choices. So if I like pizza more, I'm gonna always choose pizza. But then when we start mixing things up and there's multiple patterns coming together, there are perhaps contradicting. Like, I like pizza, my partner likes hamburgers. And who chose last time, who's injured today, who's, so many other factors are coming into it, and the patterns themselves are no longer the only determining factor. Or for example, me understanding that I always choose the wrong partners. I always choose the pizza because it makes me sick every single time because there's a pattern. I'm lactose intolerant or whatever. When we start going against those or actively choosing, in my view of free willingly choosing to go against those recognized patterns, that's where the free will still in my mind exists, because the pattern, it only has so much power. The pattern can be super complex, and I know from like signals and how they can be super complex. Signals can be represented by breakdown of simple patterns. But I still think that once we understand those patterns, and we know that there are patterns, or when there's so many contradicting or not necessarily aligning patterns, our free will of choices becomes a little bit more apparent and more free willing in a sense, than just following a much bigger pattern that I didn't actually see, that might decision to go against the pattern is part of actually a bigger pattern, I don't necessarily think is the case. Does it make sense what I said?
Yeah, I'm absolutely hearing you on that, and I'm kind of finding myself going back to this annoying little kid response, where it's like something happens and the kid asks why, and you say why, and then they ask why again, and keep asking why, and eventually you kind of hit this like, I don't know, right?
Just
And
because.
Good.
This
And that's
reasons.
kind of what happens even in all of these scenarios that we're thinking of. So we could say, let's say that from an evolutionary psychology perspective, that we have, let's say within the male species, an attraction to females, and there's this idea of mating that's just kind of it's just basically kind of as much as possible. And we could say that this is like something that's built in with this idea of reproduction, that we're trying to figure out how to reproduce. And so there's things wired into us that make it feel good and make us attracted to different people. And it's not necessarily limited to like single partners and all this kind of stuff. But then we have cultural values that come into play that are in conflict with that, right? So we have maybe a value of monogamy, and this obviously wasn't true for every time and place in history, but let's just kind of work with what we're currently dealing with. So now we've got two competing values, right? Or urges, let's say. One is there's this idea of this person looks very interesting to me, and the other one is, yeah, but I'm married, kind of a situation. And so we've got these competing ideas that are at play. Now, we're not necessarily just blindly, in a sense, following this other pattern, because we have this another pattern that's part of our makeup, part of our learning, part of what makes up how we act, that is overriding that. Why is it overriding that? Well, we've got all kinds of things that are going to be detrimental to us as we think it through about what could happen if I am not faithful in that commitment. It could mean that I lose my family. It could mean, depending on what kind of job I have, that maybe I'm going to lose my job or whatever. And so there's all these other values that are coming into play that are informing that behavior. There could be other things that are involved in terms of, let's say, alcohol, that's diminishing my ability to distinguish between those established goals that I'm striving for. Or it could be something where, maybe I was inadvertently hit on the head and I'm not in my right mind, that impacts how those kinds of decisions are being made. But with all of them, you can keep asking the question, why? Why do I have this desire? Well, because I don't want to lose my job. Well, why do you care about that? Because I need to provide for my family. Well, why do you care about that? Well, they bring me comfort and joy, and I need to think about how I'm going to survive after I can't work, retirement and so forth. And you just keep going back and back and back, and eventually you're just going to hit this block where you can't actually give any other answer other than I want to. And that's ultimately what's coming into play here, is we don't actually have an answer for all those things. And we do have competing desires. And the question about which one wins out has to do with how they're being processed. And it's kind of like a thermostat, where it's like, do I go forward or do I resist? It's going to depend on which side gets more energy, more steam, more intensity between the competing desires that you have. And all of this happens in kind of a precognitive state that we then ultimately, the way neuroscientists would talk about it, we use what's called confabulation to kind of create a narrative explanation of why we ultimately chose one thing over the other. But it's kind of something that's being already percolated and figured out before we're even consciously aware of which direction we're going to go. So even though there's lots of complexity to all kinds of decisions that are made and competing desires and competing goals, there is still at the core of it more of a we might say an unspeakable kind of emotional component, this idea of desire that's going to be ultimately stronger for one thing versus the other, which is ultimately going to make the decision for us about which way we go. And we can see that within neurological patients where they have more of that emotional center of their brain disabled for some reason, one of the primary problems they have is being able to make decisions, because ultimately our decisions aren't rational, they're emotional. And that's what drives that thermostat up or down in terms of which direction do we go, is this build up of this emotional intensity that causes us to make a decision one way or the other.
Interesting.
But it definitely has the sensation that I'm running through the reasons, that I am, and we do, right? We do, when we're confronted with the choice and we actually have time to think about it. It's not something we have to make a split-second decision on. We go through this process, but at the same time, it's all this like emotional intensity that's kind of percolating inside. This, that's what we're trying to listen to in terms of, what do I really want? And then we also try to bring in this idea of reason, but the reason those reasons are important is because they have something that we want as well, right? It's everything is ultimately about desire. We always, in a sense, do what we want. That's what we ultimately end up choosing, even when it's between different wants that we have. But we don't really get to choose why we want the want. It's just something that's just there, which gets kind of crazy. But the benefit, again, is if we start to see that there is this pattern that ends up creating these desires, that's how we start to be able to manipulate it, is by getting at what's generating these desires. If I can see that pattern, then that gives us a way to be able to engage with making change, is because that pattern exists. If the pattern didn't exist, if it was completely random, I don't know why I went and did that thing, I really regret it, and I don't know what to do about it, we'd be stuck. But if there's in fact a pattern to why that regretful action happened, then there's the possibility of learning, and there's the possibility, if we understand how the pattern works, of intervening. So you could think about something like, let's say, I'm trying to get my diabetes under control, and I need to adjust how I'm eating. And one of my, let's just say I had a problem with chocolate chip cookies for some reason. And it was just something that I really liked, and obviously not good for trying to manage, your blood sugar. One of the things I can know is that if I see a chocolate chip cookie, it's practically impossible for me to not eat it, right? So, but what I can do, because I see that pattern, is I can make sure I don't have them in my kitchen, make sure I don't even have them there. So when I'm at that point, especially when it feels like, my decision-making capacity is diminished because I've just been working hard all day and having to use my brain a lot, and I'm not going to make good choices. If it's not even available in the kitchen, that's a pattern that I can interrupt to bring about the desired change that I need, because I can see how that pattern functions. That's where the benefit of this is. It seems like it's a cage that we find ourselves in, but it's actually also the thing that makes what we really want, is that our actions are based on who we are, what we've learned, all those kinds of things. We want to be learning entities, agents, right, that are making decisions based off of past history, past learning, goals that we've established. We don't want it to be like this random, why did I do this thing? And because there's these patterns that are predictable, we can use those to bring about the kind of changes that we need to accomplish the kind of goals that we're after. We can't make any progress towards those goals if we don't recognize what those patterns are and how to interact with them. And I've been kind of talking about this for a bit, so I want to pause and hear some feedback here.
Don't make sense to me, what you're saying.
Yeah, same. Do about it. So
What's that?
said, but what do I do about it?
Well, but this would be the key, right? Is that if everything is these patterns, the more we can understand the patterns, the more we have the ability to affect change. Right? So you just have to figure out, well, what is the thing that you're trying to accomplish? The more we can understand how that works and what gets in the way, the more we have the ability to affect change by addressing those concerns, like the chocolate chip cookie idea, right? If I need to make sure I'm not eating those, when I'm in a non-hungry state, and it's easier for me to make decisions that aren't being influenced because of cravings, and it's before my brain is worn down from working all day, I can maybe make the decision to shop at that time because I'm less likely to buy stuff at the grocery store that's not what I want in my kitchen. So that then when I am in my kitchen and I am worn down, I just don't have access to those things that are problematic. It's seeing those patterns, understanding how to interrupt them to help you get to the goal that you're trying to get to.
That makes sense to me.
So we're basically replacing one set of patterns for another set of patterns, but we're doing it consciously of our own free will.
Well, you say free will, but again, why do we want to not eat cookies? Okay, well, because I don't want, my diabetes to get out of control. Why don't I want my diabetes to get out of control? Well, because I don't want to have to get on insulin. Well, why don't you want to do that? And it might go down the road of, it's going to cost too much money, or I don't like needles, or it could go down the other road of, I care about my health and I don't want to die prematurely. And you can just keep asking that why question, and it's going to get back to some kind of fundamental desire that you can't really explain other than the fact that you have it. Right? So it's still those precognitive desires that are driving the action, even though it might seem like it's really layered in terms of how you got there. I haven't really heard anything from Chaz or Dwayne on this one. You guys have any thoughts about this?
No, my brain's still trying to process things.
Is it resonating, or is it causing distress?
No, it's resonating. I think I just haven't had enough coffee yet this morning.
Speaking of,
Yeah, cheers. I think I'm curious to know what other arguments there are on the opposite side of this. Like I know in philosophy, there are arguments that are different from this, and that say you do have free will. And I'm curious to know what the devil's advocate situations are for this.
yeah,
Because this was not enough for you, right?
Exactly.
Need more confliction.
The coffee's taking it.
so you have a couple different flavors of what's called libertarian free will. One, you're taxing my brain now. So one of them is event causal libertarian free will, I think is what the definition is. And so they would argue, yes, there's events that happen that we don't have control over, that are cause and effect type of situations that we find ourselves in. And it's kind of interesting because they would then say that there's plenty of times where our actions are kind of cause and effect, but there's sometimes where they would see that there is a distinction. And kind of to Martin's point, they would bring up this idea of conflicting goals or desires, and how do these play out? And they kind of run with a particular quantum mechanics interpretation of indeterminacy, where this is interpreted very differently in different camps in quantum mechanics. The question about, when there's this, what they talk about, this wave function, is basically this cloud of possibilities of where something can be. And we don't know where it is or how fast it's going until we actually measure it. And at that point, the cloud of possibilities collapses to what we actually know, right? And so they'll talk about that as the wave collapse, or the collapse of the wave function. But all of that is just mathematical ways of talking about things that we don't actually have access to. But some interpretations of quantum mechanics would say that that particle not only is in this cloud of possibilities, but is actually all those places. And it doesn't actually end up in one place until it's measured, and that causes things to change. And the observation that causes that collapse is a part of the process. And so somehow our thoughts or our observations actually create reality through this process of the waveform collapse. The other interpretation is actually this whole probability matrix that we started working with for trying to understand the location of an electron is a way of saying we don't have enough information. We know it follows a pattern that fits within this realm. It's not going to be way over here. It's going to be somewhere within here. We just don't know exactly where. And so there's this veil of information, hidden variables are sometimes talked about, that we don't have access to. But the way the libertarian view is looking at it is they're taking that indeterminacy and how it shows up in one spot versus another as an actual random event, as opposed to something that could be predicted if we actually had more information, which would be, the other interpretation of quantum mechanics. And so they are balancing on this beam that's hoping that this particular interpretation of quantum mechanics plays out. But ultimately, they're saying that what happens is that this indeterminacy that happens at a quantum level kind of bubbles up through our neurons in our brain when we have two competing desires. And again, this is where it kind of becomes a little bit of smoke and mirrors. Somehow that indeterminacy is going to make a difference at the level of the neurons of our brain in terms of which decision is chosen. But because they're both desires that we have, whichever one is chosen is still our free will. And they would say that it was random, in the sense that if we wound the clock backwards, a person may have chosen to do something different.
So it's like saying, I like both burgers and pizza, and it just depends on how I'm feeling that day.
Well, they wouldn't even say how I'm feeling, right? Because that would be a cause, right? So
it just depends on which one I choose in that moment.
Well, they would say that ultimately it was random, because if it's how I'm feeling, it's no longer free. It's influenced by the feeling. So the only way for it to be free is if it's random. And that's the part that's super weird, is like, okay, even if we get to some point where we try to say that random is in there, do we really want our actions to be based on, randomness? I don't think that's actually what people are wanting when they think about free will, but that's what's kind of required. So in this first form of libertarian event causal libertarian free will, there's some kind of mysterious way in which this indeterminacy from quantum mechanics bubbles up into a situation where we have conflicting goals, but because we want both goals, whichever one ends up getting randomly selected is still our will because we wanted both of them. Ultimately, I don't think that makes a lot of sense to me in terms of how does that buy you anything? Why is that any different than saying that we've got different factors that are waging, in terms of our emotional reaction to desires inside our brain, ultimately winning out one over the other? I don't really see where the distinction is there. And then there's a whole nother actual like full libertarian free will kind of thing that says, yeah, for some reason, human brains are different from everything else in the universe. And we're not actually impacted by prior events and conditions that constrain what is going to happen next in terms of how our mental thought life happens. And there's various flavors of this. Frequently, you'll have something where there's some other kind of immaterial soul that's involved that allows for decisions to happen that is not impacted by physical constraints of the universe in terms of cause and effect. And then you get into all kinds of questions about, well, how does an immaterial soul communicate with a material body? You get into all sorts of this dualism questions about how would that happen? What is the mechanism by which you actually trigger that neuron to cause that muscle to contract, to get your hand to move from an immaterial soul? How do they connect to each other? Because if it's immaterial, it's not having impact on the material world, and therefore it's not impacted by causes. But then how does it actually cause anything if it's immaterial? So
I don't think there's enough coffee in the world for me to be on that page today. That is intense.
Yeah. So that's where, more of the kind of the hardcore libertarian free will ends up coming into play, that often can be accepted by more religious types of approaches, but it still has a very difficult scientific bridge to hurdle in terms of how do you, if you're going to resort to some immaterial mind that it's not impacted by cause and effect, you still have to get around to, okay, well, if it's not impacted by cause and effect, how does it actually cause effect? Right? That's the big challenge with the libertarian free will. And then there's this thing called compatibilism that has a couple of different flavors too, but frequently what I hear with compatibilism, they're saying, yes, there is a deterministic world that we live in, but free will is still compatible with that. But frequently the way I hear that one described is what we would need to know in order to predict something as complex as a human choice is so overwhelming. There's too much information that would have to be known about the state of the universe that it's unknowable by us. And therefore, it's essentially the same as saying that we're just making a decision, even though the very underlying structure might be that it's still deterministic. From a practical standpoint, it seems like we're making decisions and we should just run with it. I find that to be a bit disingenuous in terms of, if you really think that the underlying pattern is deterministic, why add this layer on top that is not what you think it to actually be? And then there's the consequences of that. They would say we need that idea of free will in order to justify our current legal system, our morality system, that requires people to be responsible for their actions. That if everything is deterministic and causal, then how could anybody be held responsible? And there's different answers for how we get to that, but that's kind of a secondary issue, right? So if you're saying that our legal system breaks down if we give up free will, even though we know determinism is true, we're going to hold on to free will because we don't want our legal system to fall apart. That doesn't quite make sense to me either. It seems like, well, then we need to readdress how we think about our legal system in light of reality. But yeah, lots of...
That's a lot.
Yeah.
That is quite the path to go down.
Yes, indeed. Well, I think we got to bring this one to a close, even though there's still a lot more we could have fun talking about. But definitely enjoyed the conversation today. And if you've been watching this as a video and you'd like to join in our conversation, you can register your email at www.kinship.cafe, and you'll get the links to this as well as the latest videos. And we'd love to see you then.
Thanks, Jim.
All right. Take care, everyone.